The desert wind carried death that morning in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen pressed his eye to the scope, watching 8 Navy SEALs sprint across open ground 2 kilometers away. They had no idea they were running straight into a kill zone. Chen had been lying motionless in his sniper hide for 14 hours, his body aching from the cramped position behind a pile of sun-bleached rocks. His mission was simple: provide overwatch for a routine patrol. What he witnessed instead would test every skill he'd learned in 8 years of military service. The Taliban fighters had set the perfect trap. Hidden in a dried riverbed, they waited with patience that only comes from fighting on home ground for decades. The SEALs, following intelligence about a high-value target, moved with the confidence of America's most elite warriors. But confidence wouldn't stop the bullets that were about to fly. Through his scope, Chen watched the lead SEAL suddenly drop to one knee, hand raised in a closed fist. The team froze instantly. Something was wrong. The SEAL's head turned slowly, scanning the terrain ahead. Chen followed his gaze through the powerful optics and felt his blood turn cold. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 different positions. The ambush had begun. What happened next would be whispered about in military circles for years to come. A single sniper, operating alone and vastly outnumbered, was about to change the course of a battle that seemed already lost. This is the story of how 8 Navy SEALs survived what should have been their final mission, and how one Marine sniper's impossible shots turned a death trap into legend. The truth is more incredible than any Hollywood movie could capture. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Jake Morrison checked his gear one final time. The SEAL Team 6 operator had done this routine hundreds of times before, but something felt different about today's mission. Maybe it was the intelligence report that seemed too good to be true, or the way the local informant had avoided eye contact during the briefing. Whatever it was, Morrison's instincts were screaming warnings he couldn't quite explain. Morrison's team had been in Afghanistan for 6 months, conducting precision raids against Taliban leadership. They were among the most experienced operators in the theater, each man a veteran of multiple deployments. Petty Officer First Class David Kim, their communications specialist, had survived 3 IED blasts and still joked about his bad luck with explosives. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Santos, their medic, had saved more lives than he'd taken, though his kill count was impressive enough. These weren't rookie soldiers, they were hardened professionals who had earned their reputation through blood and skill. The target was Ahmad Hassan Zarif, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. Intelligence suggested he was meeting with bomb makers in a compound 15 kilometers south of their forward operating base. The mission seemed straightforward. Insert via helicopter, capture or kill the target, and extract before enemy reinforcements could respond. It was the kind of operation they had executed dozens of times. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen received his orders 3 hours before dawn. As a Marine Scout sniper attached to the Joint Task Force, his job was to provide overwatch for the SEAL team's approach and extraction. Chen had been in the mountains for 2 weeks, gathering intelligence on enemy movements and calling in airstrikes on high-value targets. His hide site, carefully constructed in a cluster of boulders overlooking the valley, gave him excellent visibility of the target area and surrounding terrain. Chen had earned his reputation as one of the most skilled snipers in the Corps through years of training and multiple combat deployments. His longest confirmed kill was 1847 meters, achieved during his previous deployment in Iraq. But it wasn't just his marksmanship that set him apart. It was his ability to read terrain, predict enemy movements, and remain undetected in hostile territory for extended periods. His teammates called him Ghost because of his talent for appearing and disappearing without a trace. The SEAL team's insertion went smoothly. Their helicopter dropped them at a landing zone 5 kilometers from the target compound, well beyond the range of most small arms fire. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell, had flown countless special operations missions and knew the importance of getting her passengers safely to their destination. As the helicopter disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison's team began their approach through the rocky terrain. Chen watched through his scope as the 8 SEALs moved across the landscape like shadows. Their formation was textbook perfect, with each man covering specific sectors and maintaining proper intervals. Morrison led from the front, his experience evident in the way he chose routes that provided maximum concealment while minimizing exposure to potential threats. The team moved with the fluid coordination that comes only from years of training together. The terrain they crossed was typical of Afghanistan's eastern provinces, rocky hills separated by narrow valleys, with scattered vegetation providing minimal cover. Ancient terraces carved into the hillside spoke of a time when this land supported farming communities. Now it was a battlefield where invisible lines separated friend from foe, and death could come from any direction without warning. Through his scope, Chen could see the target compound in the distance. It consisted of several mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall, typical of rural Afghan architecture. Smoke rose from a cooking fire, suggesting the buildings were occupied. Intelligence reports indicated that Zarif was meeting with 3 bomb makers in the largest structure, planning attacks for the coming weeks. The meeting was supposed to last until mid-morning, giving the SEAL team plenty of time to reach their assault positions. Morrison's team had covered 3 kilometers when they received their first indication that something was wrong. Kim, monitoring radio communications, detected increased Taliban chatter on known frequencies. The conversations were brief and coded, but the pattern suggested heightened awareness among enemy fighters in the area. Morrison made the decision to continue the mission while increasing security measures and alerting Chen to the potential threat. Chen adjusted his position slightly, scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of enemy activity. His training had taught him to look for anything out of place: unusual shadows, reflections from metal objects, disturbed vegetation, or movement patterns that didn't match local wildlife. The morning light was perfect for observation, with clear visibility extending for several kilometers in all directions. The SEAL team reached a ridgeline overlooking the target compound just as the sun cleared the mountains. Morrison used his binoculars to study the buildings below, looking for guards, defensive positions, or anything that might indicate an ambush. The compound appeared quiet, with only a few people visible moving between buildings. It looked exactly like what they expected: a remote meeting location where Taliban leaders could plan operations without fear of surveillance. Chen's radio crackled softly as Morrison reported their position and confirmed they were beginning their final approach. The sniper acknowledged the transmission and continued his methodical scan of the area. His scope's powerful optics allowed him to see details invisible to the naked eye, and he used this advantage to search for threats the SEAL team might miss. The first sign of trouble came when Chen noticed movement in a dried riverbed about 800 meters from the compound. Through his scope, he could see what appeared to be fighting positions being occupied by armed men. They were well concealed and positioned to have clear fields of fire across the approaches to the target buildings. Chen counted at least 6 fighters, possibly more, all armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Chen immediately keyed his radio to warn Morrison's team, but received only static in response. The mountains were notorious for blocking radio communications, and his position was just beyond reliable range for their tactical radios. He tried again, adjusting his equipment and changing frequencies, but couldn't establish contact. The SEAL team was walking into an ambush, and there was no way to warn them. Morrison's team had reached the base of the final hill separating them from the compound when Kim detected another problem. His communication equipment was picking up signals from what appeared to be a coordinated network of fighters positioned throughout the valley. The pattern suggested this wasn't a routine patrol or guard detail. It was a deliberate defensive setup designed to trap anyone approaching the compound. Chen watched in growing alarm as more enemy positions became visible through his scope. The Taliban fighters had chosen their locations perfectly, creating interlocking fields of fire that would catch the SEAL team in a deadly crossfire. They had obviously been expecting visitors and had spent considerable time preparing their positions. This wasn't an intelligence-gathering meeting. It was a carefully planned ambush. The realization hit Chen like a physical blow. The intelligence that had led to this mission was false. Either their informant had been compromised, or the entire operation had been planned by the Taliban to draw in high-value American targets. Morrison's team was walking into a kill zone designed specifically for them, and they had no idea what was waiting. Chen made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. Unable to contact the SEAL team by radio, he would have to find another way to warn them. He began ranging targets through his scope, calculating distances and wind conditions. If he couldn't stop the ambush from happening, he would have to be ready to help his fellow Americans fight their way out of it. Morrison's team crested a small rise and found themselves looking down into the valley containing their target. The compound lay about 2 kilometers ahead, with apparently clear terrain between their position and the buildings. Morrison called a brief halt to study the route one final time, using his binoculars to examine every possible hiding place or danger area. Chen watched through his scope as Morrison raised his hand in a signal to advance. The 8 SEALs rose from their concealed positions and began moving down the slope toward the valley floor. They maintained perfect spacing and tactical discipline, but Chen could see what they couldn't: more than 20 Taliban fighters waiting in prepared positions along their route. The sniper's finger found his trigger, as he tracked the lead elements of the enemy ambush through his scope. He was outnumbered more than 20 to 1, operating alone without backup or support. His radio was useless. His position was compromised the moment he fired his first shot, and the enemy held every tactical advantage. But 8 American warriors were about to die unless someone did something to change the odds. Chen took a deep breath and began the mental calculations that would determine whether he could save Morrison's team. Distance to primary targets, wind speed and direction, bullet drop compensation, and a dozen other factors flowed through his mind with practiced efficiency. He had trained for moments like this his entire military career, but the reality was more intense than any simulation. The morning sun climbed higher as Morrison's team moved deeper into the valley. They were professional soldiers executing a mission with textbook precision, unaware that their every move was being watched by enemy fighters who had been waiting for hours. The trap was about to be sprung, and only one Marine sniper stood between 8 Navy SEALs and a carefully planned massacre. Chen settled deeper into his firing position and prepared for the most important shots of his life. In a few minutes, the quiet Afghan morning would erupt into a desperate battle for survival, and everything would depend on his ability to turn impossible odds into something his fellow Americans could fight through. The desert wind carried the scent of dust and death, and somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with the last peaceful transmission the valley would hear for hours. Morrison's team was 400 meters from the first enemy position when Chen saw the Taliban fighter raise his rifle. The ambush was about to begin, and there was no time left for anything but action. The Marine sniper's world narrowed to the view through his scope, his breathing steadied, and his finger tightened on the trigger that would start a battle no one would ever forget. The first shot shattered the morning silence like thunder. Chen's .338 Lapua Magnum round found its target at 847 meters, dropping the Taliban fighter who had been about to trigger the ambush. But even as the enemy fighter fell, Chen knew he had only bought Morrison's team seconds, not salvation. The muzzle flash from his rifle had revealed his position to every hostile in the valley, and the coordinated attack would begin whether their original signalman was alive or dead. Morrison heard the distant crack of the sniper rifle and instantly understood its meaning. No friendly forces were supposed to be engaging targets in this area, which meant either Chen had spotted immediate danger or they were walking into something far worse than anticipated. The SEAL team leader raised his fist, and his men froze, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. The silence that followed Chen's shot seemed to stretch forever, but Morrison's experience told him it was the calm before a deadly storm. Chen worked his bolt and acquired his second target, a machine gunner positioned in the dried riverbed. Through his scope, he could see the man frantically trying to swing his PKM machine gun toward the SEAL team's position. The sniper's second shot took the gunner in the upper chest, but Chen knew the damage was already done. The surviving Taliban fighters had heard the shots and would now begin their attack regardless of coordination. He had perhaps 10 seconds before the valley erupted into chaos. The Taliban commander, a veteran fighter named Rashid Ahmadi, had planned this ambush for 3 weeks. Intelligence gathered from sympathizers in the local population had revealed American special operations patterns, and Ahmadi had positioned his men to create an inescapable kill zone. The loss of 2 fighters to an unexpected sniper was unfortunate, but his remaining 18 men still held overwhelming advantages of position and numbers. He gave the signal to attack. Morrison's team had just reached the valley floor when muzzle flashes erupted from 6 different positions. Automatic weapons fire swept across their route of advance, forcing the SEALs to dive for whatever cover they could find among the scattered rocks and low vegetation. The sound was deafening, AK-47s chattering in rapid bursts, PKM machine guns hammering out longer streams of fire, and the distinctive whoosh of rocket-propelled grenades streaking through the air. Chief Santos felt the shockwave from an RPG explosion before he heard the detonation. The rocket had struck a boulder 3 meters from his position, showering him with rock fragments that stung his exposed skin. He rolled behind a larger stone and immediately began treating a shrapnel wound on his left forearm while returning fire toward the muzzle flashes he could see in the distance. His medical training told him the wound was superficial, but the amount of incoming fire suggested they were facing a much larger force than intelligence had predicted. Chen shifted his aim to a new target, an RPG gunner who was preparing to fire at Morrison's position. The range was 923 meters, and Chen had to account for a crosswind that had picked up as the morning progressed. His shot caught the fighter as he was shouldering his weapon, sending the RPG round spinning harmlessly into the sky. But even as Chen worked his bolt for another shot, he could see muzzle flashes winking at him from multiple positions. The enemy had located his hide site, and they were beginning to concentrate fire on his position. Petty Officer Kim crawled behind a low stone wall and frantically worked to establish radio contact with their support elements. His primary radio had been damaged by shrapnel from the first RPG volley, and his backup system was having difficulty penetrating the mountains that surrounded the valley. He could hear fragments of transmissions from their forward operating base, but couldn't establish clear two-way communication. Without radio contact, the team couldn't call for helicopter gunship support or artillery strikes that might level the odds. Morrison assessed their tactical situation with a cold logic that had kept him alive through dozens of similar engagements. His team was pinned down in minimal cover facing a numerically superior enemy force that held the high ground and had prepared positions. They had limited ammunition for an extended firefight, no immediate prospect of reinforcement, and were taking effective fire from multiple directions. By every measure of conventional tactics, they were in an impossible situation. Chen felt bullets snapping past his position as enemy fighters zeroed in on his location. Rock chips from near misses stunned his face, and he knew he had perhaps minutes before concentrated fire would make his position untenable. But those minutes might be enough to tip the balance of the fight below. He shifted his aim to a Taliban fighter who was maneuvering to flank Morrison's team from the east, leading the target by 2 body widths to account for the man's movement. His shot dropped the fighter mid-stride, disrupting what would have been a devastating flanking attack. The sound of gunfire echoed off the valley walls, creating a cacophony that made communication difficult even at close range. Morrison used hand signals to direct his men's fire toward the most dangerous enemy positions, but their tactical situation continued to deteriorate. Ammunition was being expended faster than he would have liked, and several of his men had taken minor wounds from shrapnel and ricochets. They needed to break contact and withdraw to better defensive positions, but the enemy fire was too accurate and sustained to allow movement. Santos worked to treat Petty Officer Jenkins, who had taken an AK-47 round through his left thigh. The bullet had missed the femoral artery by centimeters, but Jenkins was losing blood at a rate that would become critical within 30 minutes without proper medical attention. Santos applied a pressure dressing and administered morphine for the pain, but he knew they needed to reach proper medical facilities quickly. The problem was getting out of their current position alive. Chen had been firing for 12 minutes when he noticed something that changed his entire tactical approach. The Taliban fighters were communicating with each other using hand signals and short radio transmissions, but their coordination suggested they were following a predetermined plan rather than reacting to the developing situation. They had prepared for a static engagement where trapped Americans would be ground down by superior numbers and firepower. They had not prepared for a mobile sniper who could strike from unexpected angles. The Marine sniper made a decision that violated every principle of sniper employment he had been taught. Instead of remaining in his carefully prepared position, he began to move. Staying low and using the rocky terrain for concealment, Chen began working his way around the enemy's left flank. His movement was dangerous and exposed, but it offered the possibility of engaging targets from angles they weren't expecting. More importantly, it might draw enemy fire away from Morrison's beleaguered team. Petty Officer Williams had been designated as the team's designated marksman, and his M14 enhanced battle rifle gave him the ability to engage targets at longer ranges than his teammates' carbines. From his position behind a cluster of boulders, Williams could see several enemy muzzle flashes and began engaging them with careful, aimed shots. His first target was a machine gunner who had been keeping Santos pinned down. Williams' shot silenced the gun and allowed the medic to move to a better position. Chen reached a new firing position 300 meters from his original hide site and immediately began engaging targets from his new angle. The Taliban fighters had been concentrating their fire on his previous location and were caught off guard by shots coming from an entirely different direction. Chen's first shot from the new position took out an enemy squad leader who had been coordinating the attack on Morrison's team. His second shot disabled another machine gun that had been preventing the SEALs from maneuvering. Morrison saw an opportunity in the confusion created by Chen's relocation and made a tactical decision that would either save his team or get them all killed. Using hand signals, he directed his men to prepare for a coordinated movement to better defensive positions about 50 meters to their south. The movement would expose them to enemy fire, but their current positions were becoming untenable as Taliban fighters closed the range and improved their accuracy. The coordinated movement began with Williams and 2 other SEALs providing covering fire, while Morrison led the first group to the new positions. They moved in short rushes using whatever concealment was available and relying on speed and surprise to minimize their exposure. Chen saw the movement beginning and shifted his fire to the enemy positions most threatening to the advancing SEALs, dropping 2 fighters who had been preparing to engage the moving Americans. Santos helped Jenkins move to the new position, supporting the wounded man while maintaining his own rifle ready for immediate action. The medic's training had taught him to continue fighting even while treating casualties, and he proved the value of that training by engaging an enemy fighter who appeared from behind a rock outcropping just meters from their route. Santos's shot was hurried but effective, dropping the threat before it could engage the moving SEALs. Chen's new position gave him visibility of enemy fighters who had been hidden from his original location, and he began systematically engaging them with the methodical precision that had made him one of the Corps' most feared snipers. Each shot was carefully aimed and delivered with devastating effect, disrupting the Taliban fighters' coordination and forcing them to take cover instead of maintaining their aggressive assault on Morrison's team. The battle had been raging for 23 minutes when Morrison's team completed their movement to the new defensive positions. Their tactical situation had improved marginally, but they were still outnumbered and facing an enemy force that showed no signs of withdrawing. Ammunition was becoming a critical concern, and Jenkins needed medical evacuation soon or his condition would become life-threatening. Morrison knew they needed to either break contact entirely or find a way to decisively defeat the enemy force. Kim finally established radio contact with their forward operating base and quickly transmitted their situation and coordinates. The response was not encouraging. Helicopter gunships were 40 minutes away and artillery support was unavailable due to the proximity of friendly forces. The team would have to hold their position and continue fighting until air support could arrive, assuming they could survive that long against a determined and well-positioned enemy force. Chen had expended 18 rounds from his current position when he spotted movement that made his blood run cold. Additional Taliban fighters were approaching the valley from the north, apparently responding to the sounds of battle. Through his scope, he could count at least 12 more fighters, all armed with automatic weapons and moving with the tactical discipline of experienced combatants. The odds, already heavily stacked against Morrison's team, were about to become even worse. The sniper faced a critical decision. He could continue engaging targets from his current position, where he had good concealment and excellent fields of fire, or he could attempt another dangerous movement to a position where he might be able to interdict the approaching reinforcements before they could join the main battle. The choice would determine whether Morrison's team faced overwhelming odds or merely terrible ones. Chen chose to move again, knowing that his decision would likely determine the outcome of the battle. As he prepared to leave his position, he could see Morrison's team maintaining their disciplined defense despite the increasingly desperate nature of their situation. 8 Navy SEALs were fighting for their lives against an enemy force that now numbered more than 30 fighters, and only one Marine sniper stood between them and annihilation. The morning sun was climbing higher in the Afghan sky, and the sounds of battle echoed through valleys where countless other fights had been waged over centuries of conflict. But this particular engagement would be remembered for the impossible courage of 9 Americans who refused to accept defeat, and for the incredible marksmanship that turned certain death into legendary survival. Chen's third position took him completely outside the original battle area, placing him on a ridge that overlooked the northern approach route the Taliban reinforcements were using. The movement had taken him 12 minutes of dangerous crawling through rocky terrain, and he had been forced to leave behind most of his equipment except his rifle, ammunition, and essential gear. He was now operating with the absolute minimum necessary to continue fighting, but his new position gave him the tactical advantage he desperately needed. Through his scope, Chen could see the approaching Taliban fighters moving in a loose column formation along a goat path that wound through the rocky hills. They were moving with confidence, apparently believing that their comrades had the situation well in hand and that their arrival would simply accelerate the destruction of the trapped Americans. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive white beard, was consulting a map while directing his fighters towards positions that would complete the encirclement of Morrison's team. Morrison's situation had become increasingly desperate during Chen's movement. Enemy fire was becoming more accurate as Taliban fighters adjusted their aim points and found better positions. Petty Officer Rodriguez had taken a grazing wound across his shoulder that limited his ability to return fire effectively, and Jenkins was showing signs of shock from blood loss despite Santos's medical treatment. The team's ammunition supply was down to less than half their original load, and they still faced at least 20 active enemy fighters. Chen's first shot from his new position traveled 1,247 meters before finding its target. The Taliban leader with the white beard dropped instantly, struck in the chest by the .338 Lapua round that had been aimed with mathematical precision. The shot created immediate confusion among the reinforcement column as fighters dove for cover and tried to determine where the attack had come from. Chen worked his bolt and acquired his next target, a fighter carrying an RPG launcher who posed the greatest immediate threat to Morrison's team. The second shot dropped the RPG gunner as he was preparing to fire at the SEAL team's position. The rocket launcher clattered down the hillside, lost among the rocks and becoming useless to the remaining fighters. Chen's third shot took out a machine gunner who had been setting up his weapon to provide covering fire for the main assault. In less than 90 seconds, Chen had eliminated the three most dangerous members of the reinforcement group and thrown their entire advance into confusion. Kim had managed to establish more reliable radio contact and was coordinating with the incoming helicopter gunships, but the aircraft was still 28 minutes away. The delay was due to required clearances for engaging targets in an area where friendly forces were operating without predetermined fire support coordinates. The bureaucratic requirements that existed to prevent friendly fire incidents were now contributing to a situation where Americans might die before help could arrive. Chen shifted his position slightly to get a better angle on the remaining reinforcements, and immediately came under fire from two Taliban fighters who had spotted his muzzle flash. Bullets cracked past his head and struck the rocks around his position, forcing him to take cover while the enemy fighters tried to pin him down. He waited for a brief lull in the incoming fire, then rose quickly and engaged both targets in rapid succession. His shots were hurried but effective, silencing both rifles and allowing him to continue his systematic destruction of the reinforcement column. Morrison realized that something had changed in the tactical situation when enemy fire from the north suddenly decreased and the expected flanking attack failed to materialize. He couldn't see Chen's position or know exactly what the sniper was doing, but the effect was unmistakable. The pressure on his team was decreasing just when it should have been reaching its peak. Morrison used the opportunity to redistribute his men to better defensive positions and to conserve ammunition by engaging only the highest priority targets. Santos had succeeded in stabilizing Jenkins' condition using advanced combat medical techniques learned through years of training and experience. The wounded SEAL was still losing blood, but at a much slower rate that would allow him to survive until proper medical evacuation could be arranged. Santos had also treated Rodriguez's shoulder wound and ensured that both wounded men could still contribute to the team's defense if necessary. His medical skills were proving as valuable as his marksmanship in keeping the team combat effective. Chen's systematic engagement of the reinforcement column had reduced their effective strength by more than half, but the remaining fighters were now aware of his position and were beginning to coordinate their own attacks against him. The sniper found himself fighting a multi-directional battle, engaging targets both in the main valley where Morrison's team was trapped and on the northern ridge where the remnants of the reinforcement column were trying to flank his position. His ammunition supply was becoming a serious concern, with only 37 rounds remaining for his primary rifle. The Taliban commander in the main valley, Rashid Ahmadi, was beginning to understand that his carefully planned ambush was being disrupted by a single sniper operating from multiple positions. He had lost nearly half his fighters to impossibly accurate long-range fire, and his reinforcements had been decimated before they could join the battle. Ahmadi made the difficult decision to withdraw some of his fighters and concentrate them against the sniper position, reasoning that eliminating the American marksman would restore his tactical advantage. Williams had been engaging targets with his M14 when he spotted movement among the rocks to their east. 3 Taliban fighters were attempting to flank the SEAL team's position, moving carefully from cover to cover while the main force maintained suppressive fire. Williams alerted Morrison to the threat and began engaging the flanking force with carefully aimed shots. His first round struck the lead fighter center mass, dropping him immediately and alerting the others that their movement had been detected. Chen saw the enemy fighters beginning to reposition against him and knew he had to make another tactical decision quickly. He could remain in his current location and try to fight off the converging attacks, or he could attempt another movement that might give him better positioning but would also expose him to concentrated enemy fire during the transition. The choice was complicated by his dwindling ammunition supply and the knowledge that Morrison's team was depending on his continued effectiveness. Morrison's team had been under fire for 38 minutes when they received their first piece of genuinely good news. Kim's radio crackled with a transmission from Viper Flight, a pair of AH-64 Apache helicopter gunships that had been diverted from another mission and were now 15 minutes out from their position. The helicopters were armed with 30mm chain guns, Hellfire missiles, and rockets that could decisively tip the balance of the engagement. The challenge would be surviving until they arrived. Chen decided to attempt one more movement, this time to a position that would allow him to engage the main Taliban force from yet another unexpected angle. The movement would take him across exposed ground, where enemy fighters might spot him, but it would also position him to provide direct fire support for Morrison's team during their eventual withdrawal. He began moving immediately, knowing that every second of delay increased the chances that converging enemy forces would trap him in his current position. The sniper's fourth position was the most dangerous he had occupied during the entire engagement. Located on a rocky outcropping that provided excellent visibility but minimal concealment, The position would allow him to dominate the battlefield but would also make him extremely vulnerable to counter-sniper fire and coordinated attacks. Chen accepted the risk because the position would let him provide the most effective possible support for Morrison's team during their critical extraction phase. Santos had just finished redistributing ammunition among the team members when an RPG round exploded against the rocks 10 meters from their position. The blast wave knocked Rodriguez unconscious temporarily and reopened his shoulder wound, requiring immediate medical attention. Santos crawled to the wounded man while maintaining his own rifle ready for action, demonstrating the multitasking ability that made special operations medics among the most valuable soldiers in combat situations. Chen's first shots from his new position had devastating effects on the main Taliban force. His angle of fire allowed him to engage targets that had been safely concealed from Morrison's team, and his elevated position provided clear sight lines to enemy fighters who thought they were protected by the terrain. Chen's methodical engagement began breaking up the coordinated attacks that had been keeping the SEAL team pinned down, creating opportunities for tactical movement that hadn't existed minutes earlier. Petty Officer Davis had been serving as the team's communications security specialist, but the extended firefight had required him to function as a rifleman for most of the engagement. His position on the team's southern flank gave him visibility of enemy movements that other team members couldn't see, and he had been calling out target locations and threat assessments throughout the battle. Davis spotted 2 Taliban fighters preparing to assault the team's position with grenades and engaged both targets with rapid, accurate fire that eliminated the immediate threat. Morrison could hear the distant sound of approaching helicopters and knew that the tactical situation was about to change dramatically in their favor. The challenge would be marking enemy positions for the gunships without revealing friendly locations, and ensuring that the devastating firepower of the Apache helicopters could be employed safely despite the close proximity of opposing forces. Morrison began preparing his team for the coordination requirements that effective close air support would demand. Chen had expended 43 rounds from his new position when he observed something that made him realize the true scope of the Taliban operation. Additional enemy fighters were visible in the distance, apparently held in reserve and waiting to see how the initial engagement developed. Through his scope, Chen could count at least 15 more fighters positioned in concealed locations throughout the surrounding hills. The ambush had been even more extensive than anyone had realized, designed not just to eliminate Morrison's team, but to destroy any rescue forces that might respond to their distress calls. The realization that they were facing a force of more than 40 Taliban fighters, armed with heavy weapons and operating from prepared positions, put the morning's events in a completely different perspective. Morrison's team hadn't just survived a tactical ambush, they had fought their way through what amounted to a small-scale conventional battle against overwhelming odds. Their survival was due to exceptional training, individual courage, and the incredible marksmanship of one Marine sniper who had single-handedly disrupted a carefully planned enemy operation. Chen's ammunition situation was becoming critical, with only 18 rounds remaining for his primary rifle. Each shot had to count now, and he began selecting only the most crucial targets: machine gunners who could threaten the incoming helicopters, RPG teams that posed the greatest danger to Morrison's team, and enemy leaders whose elimination would further disrupt Taliban coordination. The mathematical precision of his shooting became even more pronounced as he calculated not just ballistics, but tactical priorities for each engagement. The sound of helicopter rotors was now clearly audible throughout the valley, and Chen could see the Apache gunships approaching from the south. Their arrival would mark the beginning of the end for the Taliban ambush, but it would also signal the most dangerous phase of the engagement for Chen himself. Once the helicopters began engaging targets, his elevated position would become a magnet for every surviving enemy fighter in the area. He prepared himself for the final phase of a battle that had already exceeded every limit of endurance and skill he had ever experienced. Chief Warrant Officer Lisa Hendricks brought her Apache gunship into the valley like an angel of destruction, her co-pilot already identifying targets through the aircraft's advanced targeting systems. 22 years of military aviation had prepared her for complex close air support missions, but the tactical situation she found below was among the most challenging she had ever encountered. American forces were scattered across rocky terrain, engaged in close combat with enemy fighters who were expertly concealed and difficult to distinguish from the surrounding landscape. Morrison quickly established radio contact with the lead Apache and began the dangerous process of marking friendly and enemy positions. Using infrared strobes invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible to the helicopter's thermal imaging systems, Morrison's team identified their locations while describing the positions of known enemy fighters. The coordination process was complicated by the fact that Taliban fighters were sometimes within 50 meters of SEAL positions, requiring extreme precision from the helicopter crews. Chen watched the Apache helicopters circle the valley and felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The arrival of close air support would dramatically change the tactical balance of the engagement, but it would also make his own position extremely precarious. Every surviving Taliban fighter in the area would soon be looking for targets they could actually engage, and his elevated position made him the most visible American on the battlefield. He had perhaps minutes before his location would become completely untenable. Hendrix's first engagement came when her co-pilot identified a machine gun position that had been harassing Morrison's team throughout the firefight. The Apache's 30mm chain gun spoke with devastating authority, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the rocky position and silencing the weapon permanently. The psychological effect of the helicopter's firepower was immediate, as Taliban fighters who had been maintaining disciplined fire positions suddenly began seeking better concealment. Chen took advantage of the confusion created by the helicopter's arrival to eliminate 3 more enemy fighters who had been moving to flank his position. His shots were delivered with the same mechanical precision he had maintained throughout the engagement, but he was now operating on pure muscle memory and training as exhaustion began to affect his judgment. 47 minutes of sustained combat under extreme stress had pushed even his exceptional endurance to its limits. Santos had managed to get both wounded team members stabilized and ready for evacuation, but the presence of hostile forces throughout the area made immediate medical evacuation impossible. The Apache helicopters would need to systematically clear enemy positions before transport aircraft could safely enter the valley. Santos continued monitoring his patients while maintaining his own combat effectiveness, knowing that the firefight was far from over despite the arrival of air support. The second Apache, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Michael Torres, engaged a group of Taliban fighters who were attempting to establish a new firing position closer to Morrison's team. Torres's approach was different from his wingman's, using the aircraft's agility to attack from multiple angles and prevent the enemy fighters from predicting his next engagement. His first rocket attack eliminated an entire enemy squad that had been preparing to assault the SEAL team's position. Chen's position came under concentrated fire as Taliban fighters throughout the valley began engaging the most visible target they could identify. Bullets sparked off the rocks around his position and forced him to maintain a much lower profile, limiting his ability to engage targets effectively. He realized that his usefulness as a sniper was approaching its end, but he continued engaging critical targets whenever the opportunity presented itself. Morrison coordinated the systematic destruction of enemy positions with a professionalism that impressed even the experienced helicopter crews. His target identification was precise and timely, allowing the Apache crews to engage threats with minimal risk of friendly fire incidents. Morrison's calm direction under extreme pressure demonstrated the leadership qualities that had made him one of the Navy's most respected special operations commanders. Petty Officer Williams spotted movement in a position that the helicopters couldn't see due to terrain masking and engaged the targets with his M14 rifle. His accurate fire eliminated 2 Taliban fighters who had been preparing to launch an RPG attack against one of the Apache helicopters. Williams' intervention prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of air support during the critical phase of the engagement. Chen made the tactical decision to abandon his 4th position when rifle fire became too accurate to ignore safely. His movement to a 5th and final position took him through terrain that offered no concealment from ground observation, forcing him to rely entirely on speed and the distraction created by the helicopter attacks. Enemy fighters spotted his movement and concentrated fire on his route, but Chen reached his new position without being hit. The psychological impact of sustained Apache helicopter attacks began breaking Taliban morale after 10 minutes of concentrated engagement. Enemy fighters who had maintained disciplined positions throughout the ground battle began abandoning their posts and attempting to withdraw from the valley. Their movement made them vulnerable to both helicopter fire and Chen's continued sniper engagement, resulting in heavy casualties among the surviving Taliban force. Kim established communication with the forward operating base and coordinated the approach of medical evacuation helicopters that would extract Jenkins and Rodriguez once the immediate area was secured. The medical aircraft were orbiting outside the valley, waiting for clearance to enter what was still an active combat zone. Their crews monitored the radio traffic and prepared for what would likely be a dangerous extraction under potential enemy fire. Chen's 5th position gave him a commanding view of the Taliban withdrawal routes, and he began engaging fleeing fighters with careful shots that eliminated key leaders and disrupted their retreat. His ammunition was now critically low, with only 9 rounds remaining, but each shot continued to have tactical impact far beyond its individual effect. The psychological pressure of accurate sniper fire was preventing the Taliban fighters from organizing any effective counterattack against the helicopters. Hendrix coordinated with ground forces to identify a landing zone where medical evacuation could take place safely. The selected area was partially shielded by terrain features that would provide some protection from small arms fire, but it still required the Apache crews to suppress enemy positions during the vulnerable landing and takeoff phases. The coordination between air and ground forces reached a level of precision that reflected years of training and combat experience. Morrison's team began preparing for movement to the extraction landing zone, but they needed continued fire support to break contact with remaining enemy fighters safely. The team had been pinned in their defensive positions for nearly an hour, and Taliban fighters had had ample time to zero in on their locations and prepare for any attempted movement. Morrison coordinated with the Apache crews to provide covering fire during the most dangerous phase of their withdrawal. Chen observed the SEAL team's preparation for movement and shifted his own fire to cover their most vulnerable approach routes. His 8th shot from the final position eliminated a Taliban fighter who had been waiting in ambush along the team's planned route of movement. Chen's 9th and final shot disabled a machine gun that had been positioned to sweep the extraction landing zone. With his primary ammunition exhausted, Chen transitioned to his backup weapons and prepared for close-range combat. The movement to the extraction landing zone required Morrison's team to cross nearly 400 meters of terrain that offered minimal concealment from enemy observation. They moved in coordinated rushes, with helicopter fire suppressing known enemy positions, while individual team members provided covering fire for their advancing teammates. The movement was executed with textbook precision despite the stress and fatigue that had accumulated during the extended engagement. Santos coordinated the medical evacuation with professional efficiency, ensuring that Jenkins and Rodriguez received proper care during their transport to the landing zone and subsequent helicopter extraction. His medical skills and leadership had kept both wounded men combat effective throughout the engagement and would now ensure their survival during the critical evacuation phase. Santos's performance exemplified the multi-dimensional capabilities that special operations medics bring to combat situations. Torres provided close fire support during the team's movement, his Apache serving as a mobile platform that could engage threats as they appeared and provide immediate response to changing tactical requirements. His coordination with ground forces was seamless, allowing for real-time adjustment of fire support based on the developing situation. Torres's flying skills and tactical judgment were instrumental in the successful extraction of Morrison's team. Chen found himself essentially cut off from the main American force as Taliban fighters who had been bypassed during the team's movement began converging on his position. The sniper faced the choice of attempting a dangerous movement to rejoin Morrison's team or remaining in position to provide continued fire support during their extraction. Chen chose to remain and fight, knowing that his sacrifice might be necessary to ensure the team's safe withdrawal. The medical evacuation helicopters entered the valley under escort from both Apache gunships. Their crews prepared for the challenging task of extracting wounded personnel from an active combat zone. The medical aircraft were specially configured for casualty evacuation, with advanced life support equipment and medical personnel capable of providing emergency treatment during flight to definitive medical care facilities. Morrison's team reached the extraction landing zone with all members still combat effective, despite the wounds suffered by Jenkins and Rodriguez. Their successful withdrawal under extreme enemy pressure demonstrated the value of intensive training, superior equipment, and exceptional individual courage. The team maintained security around the landing zone while medical personnel prepared the wounded men for evacuation. Chen's position came under assault from multiple directions as Taliban fighters attempted to eliminate the sniper who had caused such devastating casualties among their ranks. The Marine fought with his sidearm and grenades, maintaining a defense that bought precious minutes for Morrison's team's extraction. His lone stand against overwhelming odds epitomized the warrior ethos that defines America's most elite military personnel. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the valley as both medical evacuation and fire support aircraft coordinated the complex extraction operation. Radio traffic was constant as crews shared information about enemy positions, friendly locations, and tactical developments that affected the safety of all aircraft operating in the confined mountain valley. The professional coordination between multiple aircraft and ground forces reflected the sophisticated training that enables such complex operations. Morrison made the difficult decision to complete the extraction of his wounded personnel while Chen remained engaged with enemy forces at his distant position. The SEAL team leader knew that attempting to reach Chen's location would likely result in additional casualties and might compromise the successful extraction of men who needed immediate medical attention. The decision exemplified the harsh calculus that combat commanders must sometimes make under extreme pressure. As the medical evacuation helicopters departed the valley with Jenkins and Rodriguez safely aboard, the tactical situation began shifting toward a successful conclusion for the American forces. Enemy resistance was collapsing under sustained helicopter attack, and surviving Taliban fighters were withdrawing from the area rather than continuing the engagement. The carefully planned ambush had been turned into a devastating defeat through superior American training, equipment, and individual heroism that would be remembered for generations. The Apache helicopters maintained their circling pattern over Chen's position as the Marine sniper fought what appeared to be his final battle against converging Taliban forces. Hendricks could see muzzle flashes from multiple weapons concentrated on the rocky outcropping where Chen had made his stand, and she knew that no one could survive such focused firepower for very long. Her requests for permission to provide close fire support were being denied due to the extreme proximity of the enemy fighters to Chen's position. Chen had expended his pistol ammunition and was down to his final grenade when he heard something that changed everything. The distinctive sound of American voices calling his name from below. Morrison had made the decision to return for the Marine sniper, bringing his entire team back into the valley despite the risks involved. The SEAL team leader had coordinated with the Apache crews to provide maximum fire support while his men fought their way to Chen's position through terrain still occupied by hostile forces. Morrison's approach to Chen's position was a masterpiece of small unit tactics executed under extreme pressure. Using the helicopter fire support to suppress known enemy positions, the SEAL team moved through the rocky terrain with coordinated precision that reflected their years of training and combat experience. Each team member covered specific sectors while maintaining the rapid pace necessary to reach Chen before the Taliban fighters could organize a coordinated assault on his position. Santos had remained with the extraction helicopters to ensure proper medical care for Jenkins and Rodriguez, but the rest of Morrison's team was now fully committed to the rescue of the Marine sniper who had saved their lives. Williams led the advance element, using his designated marksman rifle to engage threats as they appeared along the team's route. His accurate fire eliminated 2 Taliban fighters who attempted to ambush the advancing SEALs from concealed positions. Chen heard Morrison's voice calling for him to identify his exact position and responded by popping a smoke grenade that marked his location, with distinctive orange smoke visible to both friendly forces and helicopter crews. The smoke also provided concealment that allowed Chen to move to a more defensible position within the rocky outcropping. His movement was observed by Taliban fighters who increased their rate of fire, but the smoke made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Torres brought his Apache into a low hover just meters above the rocky terrain, using the aircraft's powerful rotor wash to create a dust cloud that further degraded enemy visibility, while providing covering fire with the 30mm chain gun. His flying was aggressive and dangerous, operating the helicopter at the very limits of its performance envelope in terrain that offered no margin for error. Torres's skill and courage provided the crucial fire support that allowed Morrison's team to continue their advance. Kim had re-established communications with the forward operating base and was coordinating additional support for the rescue operation. Artillery units were preparing to fire on enemy positions outside the immediate combat area, and additional helicopter gunships were being diverted to provide fire support if the tactical situation deteriorated further. The resources being committed to the rescue of one Marine sniper demonstrated the military's absolute commitment to leaving no one behind.
Morrison's team reached a position within 50 meters of Chen's rocky fortress when they came under heavy fire from Taliban fighters who had been moving to assault the sniper's position.
The convergence of American and enemy forces in such close proximity created a chaotic firefight where identification of targets became extremely difficult.
Morrison used hand signals to coordinate his team's response while maintaining radio contact with the Apache crews to prevent friendly fire incidents. Chen could see Morrison's team advancing towards his position and began engaging Taliban fighters who were attempting to intercept them. Despite his exhaustion and limited ammunition, Chen's shooting remained devastatingly accurate as he eliminated threats that appeared in his field of view. His fire support was crucial in allowing the SEAL team to continue their advance through terrain that would otherwise have been impossible to traverse under enemy fire. Hendricks coordinated a complex fire support mission that required engaging enemy positions within meters of both Chen's location and Morrison's advancing team. Her targeting had to be precise enough to eliminate threats without endangering the Americans she was trying to protect. The mission pushed both her flying skills and her weapon systems to their absolute limits, requiring split-second decisions that could mean the difference between rescue and catastrophe. Davis had taken point for Morrison's team and was the first to reach Chen's position, arriving just as the Marine sniper was preparing to make a final stand with his combat knife. The reunion between the American warriors was brief but emotional, as Chen had assumed he would die alone on the rocky outcropping. Davis quickly assessed Chen's condition and determined that despite exhaustion and minor wounds, the sniper was capable of moving under his own power. The withdrawal from Chen's position required the combined team to fight their way through Taliban forces that were now fully aware of the rescue operation and were attempting to prevent the Americans from escaping. Morrison coordinated the movement with tactical brilliance, using helicopter fire support and coordinated small unit tactics to create a corridor through enemy positions. The fighting was intense and close range, requiring every team member to demonstrate exceptional skill and courage. Williams and Rodriguez formed the rear guard during the withdrawal, engaging pursuing Taliban fighters with accurate rifle fire that discouraged close pursuit. Their disciplined marksmanship allowed the main body of the team to maintain movement toward the extraction landing zone without being overwhelmed by enemy pressure. The rearguard action demonstrated the selfless courage that defines special operations personnel in combat situations. Chen's extraction from his position marked the beginning of the end for Taliban resistance in the valley. Enemy morale, already damaged by heavy casualties and the failure of their ambush, collapsed completely when they realized that the Americans were successfully extracting the sniper who had caused such devastating losses. Surviving Taliban fighters began abandoning their positions and withdrawing from the area, rather than continuing an engagement they could no longer win. Torres continued providing close air support during the team's movement to the extraction landing zone, his Apache serving as both a weapons platform and a psychological deterrent to enemy action. His aggressive flying and precise gunnery had been instrumental in the successful rescue operation, demonstrating the crucial role that skilled aviators play in special operations missions. Torres's performance under extreme pressure exemplified the professionalism of military aviation personnel. Morrison's combined team reached the extraction landing zone after a running firefight that had lasted 20 to 3 minutes. All team members were accounted for and combat effective, though several had sustained minor wounds during the intense engagement. The successful rescue of Chen had been accomplished without additional serious casualties, a testament to superior training, equipment, and individual courage under extreme pressure. The extraction helicopters returned to the valley under heavy escort, their crews prepared for the challenging task of recovering the combined American force from terrain still potentially threatened by enemy action. The medical aircraft crews had already demonstrated their courage during the previous extraction, and they approached this mission with the same professional competence that had characterized their earlier performance. Chen's first words to Morrison were an apology for compromising the original mission by engaging enemy forces before the ambush was triggered. Morrison's response was immediate and emphatic. Chen's intervention had saved all their lives, and the Marine sniper was being recommended for the Navy Cross for his extraordinary heroism under fire. The conversation between the two warriors reflected the mutual respect that exists between America's most elite military personnel. Kim coordinated the final extraction with air traffic control while maintaining communications with higher headquarters about the tactical situation throughout the valley. Enemy resistance had effectively ended, with surviving Taliban fighters withdrawing from the area rather than continuing an engagement that had cost them more than 30 casualties. The failed ambush would serve as a warning to other enemy forces about the consequences of engaging American Special Operations personnel. Santos rejoined the team during the final extraction phase, having ensured that Jenkins and Rodriguez received proper medical care during their evacuation to the forward operating base. Both wounded men were expected to make full recoveries and return to active duty within months. Santos's medical skills and leadership during the engagement had been crucial in preventing what could have been fatal casualties among Morrison's team. The helicopter extraction was completed without incident, as the Apache gunships maintained overwatch and enemy forces continued their withdrawal from the valley. The departure of American forces marked the end of an engagement that had lasted more than 2 hours and had resulted in a decisive tactical victory despite impossible initial odds. The battle would be studied in military schools for years to come as an example of how superior training and individual courage can overcome overwhelming enemy advantages. Chen's rifle was recovered from his final fighting position, along with the equipment he had been forced to abandon during his movements throughout the battle. Examination of his gear revealed that he had fired 67 rounds during the engagement, with an estimated hit rate of more than 90%. His marksmanship under extreme combat stress represented shooting that exceeded even the highest standards of military sniping. Morrison submitted his after-action report 3 days later, emphasizing the crucial role that Chen's intervention had played in the survival of his entire team. The report detailed how the Marine sniper's accurate fire had disrupted a carefully planned Taliban ambush and had provided the tactical breathing space necessary for effective helicopter support to arrive. Morrison's recommendation for Chen's Navy Cross was endorsed at every level of command. The intelligence gained from the engagement revealed that the Taliban had been planning similar ambushes throughout the region, using false information to lure American Special Operations teams into carefully prepared kill zones. Chen's disruption of the first ambush had not only saved Morrison's team, but had also compromised an entire network of enemy operations planned for the following weeks. The tactical success had strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate engagement. Chen returned to duty after a brief period of medical evaluation and psychological counseling, designed to help combat veterans process the intense experiences of extended firefights. His performance during the Valley engagement had established him as one of the most skilled snipers in military history, but Chen remained characteristically modest about his achievements. His focus remained on his mission and his fellow service members rather than on personal recognition. The Navy Cross ceremony took place 6 months later at the Pentagon, with Chen's family and Morrison's entire team in attendance. The citation specifically mentioned Chen's willingness to abandon tactical doctrine and risk his own life to save fellow Americans under impossible circumstances. The decoration represented not just individual heroism, but the warrior ethos that defines America's Special Operations community. Morrison's team continued their deployment in Afghanistan, conducting additional missions that benefited from the tactical lessons learned during the Valley engagement. Their reputation for surviving impossible odds made them a symbol of American military excellence, though they remained focused on their mission rather than their fame. The team's continued success validated the training and selection processes that create special operations personnel. Chen completed his military service 2 years later, transitioning to civilian life with honors that reflected a career dedicated to serving his country at the highest levels of military performance. His Valley engagement remained classified for national security reasons, but his reputation within the special operations community ensured that his story would be remembered and retold as an example of what American warriors can accomplish when duty and courage combine with exceptional skill. The valley in Afghanistan's Helmand province returned to its ancient silence after the Americans departed, but the events of that morning had changed everything for the men who fought there. 8 Navy SEALs owed their lives to one Marine sniper who had refused to accept the impossible odds and had instead chosen to fight with such skill and determination that legend became reality. The story of their survival would inspire future generations of American warriors who might one day face their own impossible moments and would need to find within themselves the same courage that had turned certain death into extraordinary victory.